At 76, Adolph Shelton thought time itself was on his side. He smiled when the deputies cuffed him, smirked when the cameras flashed, and cracked jokes about taking his retirement in the county courthouse. He believed no jury would ever condemn a man of his advanced age to a real, crushing sentence. "What are they going to do?" he had asked his lawyer with a raspy chuckle. "Lock me up until I am 90? When the verdict of guilty finally arrived, he did not weep or hang his head. Instead, he waved at the gallery like a politician on parade. He winked at the judge and leaned back in his chair, wearing his bright orange jumpsuit with the crisp white undershirt showing at the collar. He looked the part of a stubborn but harmless grandfather. He told his defense team that he was too old for prison anyway, and that the state would not want to pay for his heart medication. But the judge did not blink. She did not return his smile. Inside her thick legal file was a digital recording that Adolph had forgotten existed. It was a voicemail he had accidentally left on his grandson's phone. A calm and deliberate recording that proved he had been planning to kill his neighbor for weeks. When she finally pronounced his sentence of 75 years without the possibility of parole, the courtroom went dead silent. Adolph tried to laugh again. He opened his mouth to deliver one last quip, but the sound never came out. By the time the guards led him away, his watery blue eyes finally understood what the passage of years actually meant. It was not the decades of life he had already lived, but the lifetime he had left to endure. Every single second of it spent behind cold iron bars. The morning of the arraignment in Greenwell County was uncharacteristically warm for a Kansas spring. Adolph Shelton sat in the back of the transport van, whistling a tune that only he seemed to know. He was dressed in the standard-issue orange jumpsuit, a garment that should have signaled shame, but instead seemed to serve as his costume for the day. He adjusted the white undershirt beneath the heavy polyester fabric, making sure it was straight. To Adolph, this was not a murder trial. It was a stage. He had spent 76 years cultivating the image of a rugged, independent cattleman who took no nonsense from anyone. When the van doors opened and the bright sunlight hit his face, he did not shield his eyes. He looked directly into the lens of a local news camera and gave a sharp, military-style salute. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled of floor wax and old paper. The bailiff, a man named Miller, who had known Adolph for 20 years, stood by the gate. Adolph leaned in as he walked past and whispered that he hoped the cafeteria served Salisbury steak because he had a coupon for a senior discount. Miller did not laugh, but Adolph chuckled loudly enough for the first 3 rows of spectators to hear him. He took his seat at the defense table next to Marcus Thorne, a court-appointed lawyer who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. Marcus leaned over and told Adolph to keep his mouth shut. He warned him that every word he said was being recorded, and that the prosecutor, Clara Vance, was looking for any reason to paint him as a cold-blooded killer. Adolph just patted the lawyer's hand and told him not to worry his pretty little head. Clara Vance stood at the prosecution table, her hands flat on the wood. She was 40 years younger than Adolph and possessed a reputation for being relentless. She watched as the defendant winked at a woman in the 3rd row. Clara knew that Adolph's defense was built on the idea of a senior citizen who had simply snapped under the pressure of a decades-long feud. The initial charge was second-degree murder, based on Adolph's claim that he had been in a defensive altercation with his neighbor, Silas Green. According to Adolph, Silas had come onto his property waving a crowbar, and Adolph, fearing for his fragile life, had reached for his shotgun. He claimed the weapon discharged accidentally during a struggle. But Clara had the physical evidence. She had the shotgun, a heavy 12-gauge pump action that required a significant amount of force to rack and fire. The laboratory reports from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation were clear. There were no fingerprints on the barrel or the forend, other than those belonging to Adolph Shelton. There were no signs of a struggle on the grass where Silas Green's body had been found. The grass had not been trampled. The victim's clothes were not torn. It looked less like a fight and more like an execution. Clara looked at her notes and sighed. She whispered to her assistant that Adolph was laughing because he thought she would be too intimidated by his age to truly go after him. She promised right then that she would make him cry before the trial was over. The investigation had begun on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun was high over the fence line that separated the Shelton and Green properties. Detective Joe Sanders had been the first on the scene. She had found Silas Green lying face down in the dirt, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Adolph was sitting on his porch, rocking back and forth in a wooden chair, the shotgun resting across his knees. He had been remarkably calm. He told the detective that Silas had finally pushed him too far. He said they had been arguing about that fence line since the Reagan administration, and that Silas had come over to move the posts again. Detective Sanders had carefully documented the scene. She used a high-resolution digital camera to capture every angle of the body and the surrounding terrain. She noted that the safety on the shotgun was off. She also noted that Adolph's hands were steady. There was no shaking, no signs of the adrenaline dump that usually follows a traumatic event. She had the weapon bagged and tagged. Later, at the precinct, she sat across from Adolph in the interrogation room. The room was small, with grey soundproofing on the walls and a single metal table. Adolph asked for a glass of lemonade. When she told him they only had water, he complained that the service in this hotel was going downhill. He maintained his story with practiced ease. He said it was a tragic accident, a case of an old man defending his castle. During the second week of the trial, the defense began parading a series of character witnesses to the stand. These were the legends of Greenwell County, men and women who had grown up with Adolph. They spoke of his time in the service, though his record was mostly administrative. They called him a colorful character and a devoted grandfather who wouldn't hurt a fly unless that fly was on his land. One witness, an elderly woman named Martha, testified that Adolph always helped her carry her groceries. Marcus Thorne asked her if she thought Adolph was capable of premeditated murder. Martha scoffed and said the idea was ridiculous, that Adolph was just a grumpy old man who liked his privacy. Throughout this testimony, Adolph performed for the room. He nodded solemnly at the mentions of his service. He blew a kiss to Martha when she left the stand. He was winning over the gallery, and he knew it. He saw himself as the protagonist in a movie about the dying breed of the American West. But while the defense was building a monument to Adolph's character, Detective Sanders was working on something else. She had obtained a warrant for the digital records of Adolph's cellular phone and those of his immediate family. She had a hunch that the defendant's habit of talking to himself might have left a trail. The forensic process was slow and methodical. The digital forensic experts at the State Crime Lab had to navigate through layers of deleted files and cloud backups. They were looking for any communication between Adolph and his family in the days leading up to the shooting. At the same time, the ballistics team was finishing their report. They had conducted a series of tests on the shotgun. They used a block of ballistic gelatin to simulate the impact on the human body. The results were chilling. The spread of the shot indicated that the muzzle of the gun was at least 10 feet away from Silas Green when it was fired. This directly contradicted Adolph's story of a hand-to-hand struggle over the weapon. If they had been fighting over the gun, the entry wound would have shown signs of muzzle burn and a much tighter shot pattern. Furthermore, the search of Adolph's workshop had turned up a rag soaked in gun-cleaning solvent. The chemicals were still fresh when the police arrived. This suggested that Adolph had cleaned the weapon immediately after the shooting, a strange action for someone who had just accidentally killed their neighbor in a panic. Detective Sanders had noted this in her report, calling it preparation disguised as forgetfulness. She knew that a man in a state of shock does not typically stop to perform routine maintenance on his firearm. By the middle of the second week, the mood in the courtroom began to shift. Clara Vance called a local land surveyor to the stand. The surveyor testified that the property value of the land in Greenwell County had tripled in the last 18 months due to a new highway project. If Silas Green were out of the picture, Adolph would have had the sole right to sell the disputed acreage to the developers. Clara introduced evidence of deed transfer filings that Adolph had prepared and signed just 1 week before the shooting. These documents were designed to move the land into a trust controlled by his grandson. When Marcus Thorne cross-examined the surveyor, he tried to argue that Adolph was simply getting his affairs in order due to his age. He asked the witness if it was a crime for an old man to think about his legacy. The witness admitted it was not, but the timing was suspicious. Adolph didn't seem bothered. During a recess, he walked past a group of reporters in the hallway. He stopped, leaned on his cane, and told them that you can't teach an old dog new laws. He cackled at his own joke, the sound echoing off the marble walls. The guards had to nudge him along to keep the hallway clear. He was enjoying the attention, convinced that his local celebrity status would act as a shield against the facts. The turning point came in the middle of Act 2, when Detective Sanders finally received the results from the digital data recovery. She sat in her office, wearing headphones, and listened to a series of recordings. Most of them were mundane. Adolph complaining about the weather or asking his grandson how to fix the television remote. But then she found it. It was a voicemail left on his grandson's phone 3 days before Silas Green was killed. The grandson had never listened to it, or perhaps he had and chose to ignore it. The recording was 30 seconds long. It began with the heavy breathing of an old man who had forgotten to hang up the phone. Then, Adolph's voice came through, clear and cold. He wasn't joking. He wasn't performing. He said, "Tomorrow he will finally learn who owns that fence line." There was a pause, and then the distinct, rhythmic metallic sound of a shotgun being racked. Chuck, chuck. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of a predator preparing for the hunt. Sanders felt a chill run down her spine. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof of premeditation that would turn a second-degree murder charge into a life sentence. The process of authenticating the audio was rigorous. Clara Vance knew that the defense would fight to keep this out of the trial. She brought in an audio engineer who specialized in digital forensics. The engineer used software to analyze the frequency of the voice and compared it to known samples of Adolph's speech. He also analyzed the background noise, identifying the specific acoustic signature of Adolph's wooden porch. He was able to verify that the sound of the shotgun racking matched the specific mechanical profile of the 12-gauge recovered at the scene. There were no edits, no splices, and no digital manipulation. It was a raw, honest window into the defendant's mind. When the prosecutor informed the defense that she intended to introduce this evidence, Marcus Thorne filed an immediate objection. He argued that the recording was irrelevant and that it was impossible to prove what Adolph was talking about. He claimed his client was likely talking about a stray dog or a coyote. In the courtroom, Adolph leaned over to his lawyer and whispered loud enough for the court reporter to hear. He said he probably said worse things on bingo night, and that the prosecutor was just making a mountain out of a molehill. He was still laughing, still performing for the cameras that were allowed in the back of the room. He had no idea that the noose was tightening. The morning of the reveal, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation. The victim's widow sat in the front row, her face a mask of quiet grief. She had lived next to Adolph for 40 years and had always been terrified of him. Clara Vance called the audio expert to the stand. She moved slowly, building the tension. She had the expert explain the science of sound waves and the reliability of digital timestamps. The jury was leaning forward, their eyes darting between the expert and the defendant. Adolph was still smirking. He adjusted his orange jumpsuit and looked at his fingernails, pretending to be bored. He even took a moment to wink at a young journalist. Clara asked the judge for permission to play the recording. The judge, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach to the law, nodded and gave the order. The courtroom went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. Then the speakers crackled to life. The voice that filled the room was not the voice of the charming old man the jury had seen for the last 2 weeks. It was a voice of pure, calculated malice. Tomorrow he will finally learn who owns that fence line. The silence that followed the words was even heavier. Then came the sound, the sharp, mechanical racking of the shotgun. It sounded like a death knell. In that moment, the color drained from Adolph's face. His smirk didn't just fade, it vanished, leaving his mouth hanging open in a hollow expression of shock. He looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, but even his own lawyer was looking down at the table, unable to meet his eyes. The jury's reaction was immediate. A collective gasp moved through the room. One juror covered her mouth with her hand. The victim's widow didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and nodded, as if a long-held truth had finally been spoken aloud. The defense's narrative of a reflexive, panicked accident was dead. The court had just heard laughter and preparation as a motive for murder. The final act of the trial was the sentencing. By this time, the bravado had largely left Adolph, but he still tried to cling to his persona. He walked into the courtroom for the final time, his steps a little slower, his shoulders a little more hunched. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before the sentence was passed, Adolph stood up. He tried to muster one last joke. He looked at the judge and asked if she was going to give him 200 years, because he wasn't sure he could finish the whole term. He expected a ripple of laughter from the gallery, but there was only a cold, hard silence. The judge looked at him over her glasses. She didn't speak for a long minute. She let the silence sit in the air, let it weigh down on the defendant until he shifted uncomfortably in his orange jumpsuit. Then she began to speak. Her voice was calm, but it had the weight of a mountain. She told Adolph that age does not erase accountability. She said that throughout the entire trial, he had treated the life of Silas Green and the laws of the state as punchlines in a long, cruel joke. She spoke about the arrogance it took to plan a murder and then think that a smile and a wink would be enough to escape justice. She mentioned the voicemail, calling it a window into a soul that had no room for remorse. She told him that he had spent his life believing he was untouchable because of his history and his standing in the community, but that the law did not care about his reputation. It only cared about the truth. The judge's condemnation was a complete verbal destruction of Adolph's ego. She told him that he might die laughing, perhaps, but he would do so behind bars where no one would hear him. She then pronounced the sentence. For the crime of premeditated murder in the first degree, she sentenced him to 75 years in the state penitentiary. Because of his behavior throughout the trial and his blatant mockery of the proceedings, she added an additional 5 years for contempt of court to be served consecutively. The total was 80 years. At 76 years old, it was a death sentence. Adolph's collapse was physical. He sank back into his chair, his body seeming to shrink within the orange jumpsuit. The white undershirt now looked like a shroud. The smirk was gone, replaced by a twisted, silent mask of terror. He tried to speak, to offer one last defense, but his voice failed him. He realized in that moment that his performance was over, and the audience had hated the show. The grandson, who had received the voicemail, stood in the back of the room. He later told reporters that his grandfather had effectively recorded his own sentence. He said the family was relieved that the truth had come out, even if it meant their patriarch would die in a cell. The aftermath of the Shelton case was felt throughout the state. It inspired a movement for legal reform, with many calling for mandatory psychological evaluations for elderly defendants who tried to use their age as a shield against criminal charges. But in Greenwell County, the impact was more personal. The fence line that had caused so much blood and misery remained, but it was no longer a point of contention. The land was eventually sold, and the proceeds were used to create a small park in memory of Silas Green. On the day Adolph was transported to the maximum security prison, there were no cameras. There were no reporters to hear his jokes. He sat in the back of the van, the same way he had arrived, but the whistling had stopped. When he arrived at the facility, the guards processed him with a cold efficiency that didn't care about his war stories or his senior status. They took his civilian clothes and gave him a fresh set of oranges. As he was led to his cell, he passed an older inmate who was cleaning the floor. Adolph tried to offer a small, raspy chuckle, a ghost of his former self. The other inmate didn't even look up. The judge's final words echoed in his mind as the heavy steel door slammed shut. "You said you were too old for prison," she had said. "Now prison will be too long for you." Adolph sat on the narrow cot and looked at the grey walls. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was the one who didn't get the joke. The silence of the cell was absolute, swallowed only by the fading hum of a laugh that had finally, mercifully, run out of breath. The legal team for the prosecution sat in a small bar across from the courthouse that evening. Clara Vance ordered a drink and looked at the empty chair where her assistant usually sat. They had won, but there was no sense of celebration. The case had been a grim reminder of how easily a person can justify their own darkness. Clara thought about the forensic details, the way the chemicals in the rag had proven the intent just as much as the audio recording had. She thought about the chain of custody for that phone, the way Detective Sanders had meticulously logged every step of the recovery process to ensure the evidence would hold up under the most intense scrutiny. The science of the case had been the backbone, but the human element had been the heart. The arrogance of Adolph Shelton had been his undoing. If he had been a quiet, remorseful old man, he might have received a lighter sentence. He might have convinced a jury that it was a moment of weakness. But his need to be the center of attention, his need to perform, had stripped away any chance of mercy. In the prison, the routine was the same every day. Adolph woke up at 5 a.m. to the sound of a buzzer. He ate breakfast in a crowded hall where no one cared about his senior discount. He spent his days in the laundry room, folding sheets until his hands ached. He no longer wore the crisp white undershirt. The prison issues were thin and grey. His health began to decline, as he had predicted, but the state provided the medication he needed to keep living. It was the ultimate irony. The very system he had mocked was now the thing keeping him alive so that he could finish his sentence. He became a shadow in the corner of the yard, a man who had once been a legend in his own mind, and was now just a number on a ledger. Sometimes new inmates would ask him what he was in for. He would start to tell the story of the fence line, but he would stop before he got to the end. The punchline wasn't funny anymore. Back in Greenwell County, the story of Adolph Shelton became a cautionary tale. It was told to children as a warning about the dangers of pride and the weight of a grudge. The local historical society even kept a copy of the trial transcript in their archives. They wanted to ensure that the memory of what had happened on that fence line was preserved, not as a tribute to the man in the orange jumpsuit, but as a testament to the fact that justice, while sometimes slow, is ultimately unavoidable. The digital recording was kept in a secure evidence locker at the state capitol. It remained there, a silent witness to a crime that had been planned in the quiet of a Kansas evening and revealed in the light of a courtroom. As the years passed, the name Adolph Shelton faded from the headlines. The highway project was completed, and the land he had killed for was covered in asphalt and concrete. Thousands of cars drove over the spot where Silas Green had fallen, the drivers unaware of the history beneath their tires. The fence line was gone, replaced by the progress of a world that had moved on without the old man. In his cell, Adolph would sometimes close his eyes and try to remember the sound of the wind through the tall grass on his porch. He would try to remember the feeling of the sun on his face, but all he could hear was the metallic sound of a shotgun racking, a sound that played on a loop in the back of his mind, a reminder that he was the architect of his own cage. The judge who had sentenced him eventually retired. On her last day, she was asked about the most memorable case of her career. She didn't hesitate. She spoke about the man who thought he was too old to be a criminal. She spoke about the power of a single piece of evidence to tear down a lifetime of lies. She said that the Shelton case had taught her that the law is not just about rules and regulations, but about the fundamental truth of human character. She recalled the way Adolph had looked when the sentence was read, the way the performance had finally ended. It was not a memory of triumph for her, but one of solemn duty. She had seen many people pass through her courtroom, but none had possessed the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the man in the orange jumpsuit. The final image of the trial, preserved in the minds of those who were there, was the empty defense chair. After Adolph had been led away, the room had remained still for a long time. The gavel's final echo had seemed to linger in the air, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a long and tragic chapter. The gallery had cleared out slowly, the spectators speaking in hushed tones. The cameras were packed away, the lights were turned off, and the doors were locked. The courtroom returned to its natural state of quiet, a place where the weight of the law was felt in every shadow. And in the silence, the memory of that last, broken laugh seemed to hang like dust in the air before finally being swallowed by the stillness of the room. The case of the state versus Adolph Shelton was closed. But the lesson it left behind remained as clear as the blue Kansas sky. Justice does not have an expiration date, and no one, no matter their age or their stories, is ever truly untouchable. The procedural details of the case were later used as a textbook example in law enforcement academies across the country. They studied the way Detective Sanders had used digital forensics to find the hidden voicemail. They analyzed the ballistics reports and the way the physical evidence had been used to dismantle the defendant's false narrative. The case proved that in the modern era, even the most traditional crimes are subject to the relentless eye of technology. It showed that the digital footprint we leave behind is often more honest than the stories we tell ourselves. The white undershirt that Adolph had worn, so carefully straightened and maintained, became a symbol of the facade he had tried to present to the world. It was a clean, simple garment, covering a heart that was anything but. As the decade turned, the story of the Greenwell County shooter became a piece of local folklore. People would point to the spot where the old house had stood and tell the story of the man who laughed at the law. They would describe the orange jumpsuit and the way he had saluted the cameras. But the focus of the story always shifted back to the voicemail. It was the piece of the puzzle that made everything else make sense. It was the moment the mask fell off and the true face of the killer was revealed. It was the smoking gun that ensured a murderer would spend the rest of his days in the one place he thought he would never go. The sentencing of Adolph Shelton was more than just a legal conclusion. It was a moral reckoning. It was a statement by the community that they would not be charmed or intimidated into overlooking a cold-blooded act of violence. It was a victory for the family of Silas Green, who finally received the justice they had been denied for so long. And it was a reminder to every person who walked into that courtroom that the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The 75 years were not just a number. They were a reflection of the gravity of the crime. They were a shield for the public and a penance for the guilty. When the news of Adolph's death in prison finally reached Greenwell County many years later, there were no tributes. There was no funeral attended by the masses. He had outlived his friends and his reputation. He was buried in a small, plain cemetery on the grounds of the correctional facility, his grave marked only by a simple stone. The man who had wanted to be a legend died in obscurity, his jokes forgotten and his performance long since ended. The only thing that remained was the record of his crime and the memory of the day the law finally caught up to him. The empty defense chair in the Greenwell County Courthouse remained, a quiet witness to the thousands of cases that followed. But none would ever quite match the drama of the old man who thought he could laugh his way out of a murder. The impact of the trial on the local legal community was profound. Clara Vance went on to become the district attorney, her career defined by her refusal to be intimidated by anyone, regardless of their status. She often kept a copy of the ballistics report from the Shelton case on her desk. It served as a reminder that the smallest detail can be the most important. Detective Jo Sanders was promoted to captain, her investigative instincts celebrated as some of the best in the state. They both knew that the case had been a once-in-a-lifetime event, a perfect storm of evidence, arrogance, and justice. They had seen the worst of humanity in Adolph Shelton, but they had also seen the best of the system that was designed to contain it. In the end, the story of Adolph Shelton was not a tragedy about an old man losing his freedom. It was a story about the strength of the truth. It was about the way a single, accidental recording could destroy a mountain of lies. It was about the judge who stood her ground and the prosecutor who wouldn't let go. It was about the victim who finally got the last word, even from beyond the grave. And as the sun set over the Kansas plains, the fence line that had started it all was long gone. But the justice that had been served there remained, as solid and unyielding as the earth itself. The silence that now covered the land was not the silence of a secret, but the silence of a peace that had been earned through the long, hard process of the law. The old man had run out of jokes, and the world was better for it. The defense attorney, Marcus Thorne, eventually wrote a memoir about his years in the courtroom. He dedicated an entire chapter to the Shelton trial. He wrote about the difficulty of representing a client who was his own worst enemy. He described the moment he first heard the voicemail and the realization that there was no way to save a man who had already condemned himself. He admitted that while he had done his duty as a lawyer, he had felt a sense of relief when the verdict was read. He knew that Adolph Shelton was exactly where he belonged. The book became a bestseller, and the chapter on the arrogant old man in the orange jumpsuit was the most talked about section. It provided a rare look behind the scenes of a trial that had captivated a state and changed the way people thought about justice. The legacy of the case lived on in the legal precedents it set. It was cited in dozens of subsequent trials involving digital evidence and the admissibility of accidental recordings. It became a cornerstone of Kansas law, a benchmark for how to handle defendants who used their personal history to manipulate the court. The judge's condemnation was quoted in legal journals and taught in law schools as a masterclass in judicial integrity. She had not just sentenced a man, she had defended the dignity of the court. She had shown that the robe she wore was a symbol of something much larger than any one person. As the years turned into decades, the physical evidence was eventually destroyed as part of the routine clearing of old files. The shotgun was melted down, the rag was incinerated, and the digital files were archived in a format that few people could still read. But the story stayed alive. It was part of the DNA of Greenwell County now. It was a story of a fence line, a phone call, and a man who thought he was smarter than the world. It was a story that ended with a 75-year sentence and a silence that would never be broken. And in that silence, the truth continued to resonate, a clear and steady note in the often messy song of human existence. The courtroom drama of Adolph Shelton was over, but its echoes would be heard for as long as people sought justice, and as long as they remembered the man who died laughing behind bars. The final word on the case was perhaps best left to the grandson, who had inadvertently provided the key evidence. In an interview years later, he was asked if he felt guilty about the role he had played in his grandfather's downfall. He shook his head and said that he didn't. He said that his grandfather had made his choices long before that phone call was made. He said that the voicemail wasn't a mistake. It was an admission. It was the truth coming out when it was least expected. He said that he hoped his grandfather had found some peace in his final years. But he also hoped he had finally understood that the most important thing a man can own isn't a piece of land or a fence line. It's his own integrity. And that was something Adolph Shelton had lost a long, long time ago. The story of the senior defendant who wore an orange jumpsuit with a white undershirt remained a stark reminder that the theater of the courtroom is no place for a performance that lacks a soul. The judge's words, that age does not erase accountability, became a mantra for those who sought to hold the powerful and the popular to the same standards as everyone else. The case was a victory for the quiet people, the ones like Silas Green who just wanted to live their lives without being harassed or threatened. It was a victory for the law, which proved that it was strong enough to withstand the charms of even the most practiced performer. And as the last of those who remembered the trial passed away, the story remained, etched into the history of the county like a name on a headstone, a permanent record of the day the laughter died and the truth took its place. The orange jumpsuit, the white undershirt, the silver hair, and the mocking grin were all gone now. The courtroom in Greenwell County continued to host trials, to hear arguments, and to pass sentences. New defendants sat in the same chair where Adolph had once smirked at the world. But none of them ever quite captured the attention of the community in the same way. None of them ever faced a judge with the same level of calculated arrogance. And none of them ever left behind a legacy that was so defined by a single, accidental moment of honesty. The case of Adolph Shelton was a unique chapter in the annals of Kansas justice, a story that reminded everyone that no matter how old you are never too old to face the consequences of your actions. The long walk from the defense table to the cell was a journey that Adolph had started decades before, and it was a journey that had finally reached its inevitable end. The silence of the courtroom after his departure was the most powerful statement of all, a silence that spoke of a job well done and a community that could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The old man's performance was over, and the curtain had fallen for the very last time.